Greetings, I'm Daniel Carlton, artist in residence with Harlem Is. In fact, for 20 years, I've been part of the Community Works and New Heritage Theater family, helping to celebrate the cultural history of Harlem through school programs, landmark exhibition and multicultural workshops, and performances. Today, we continue the Harlem Is Healing Dialogue series. Beginning weeks after the pandemic broke out, Community Works interviewed over 45 honorees who were helping Harlem heal, not just from the ravages of the pandemic, but also folks who are finding ways to reduce violence and hate and to seek more equitable racial justice efforts. Their stories were posted on Facebook, Instagram, and now are part of the Harlem Is website, www.harlem-is.org. Today's incredible host is renowned journalist and author Lee Daniels, formerly of the New York Times and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and author of several books about race. He's speaking with the Reverend Michael A. Waldron Jr., senior pastor at First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem. Pastor Mike, as he is called, is leader of Harlem's largest church congregation. Before we begin this incredible dialogue ahead of us, I'd like to humbly present my own tribute to the many community and religious leaders who are helping us heal. Now, I'm going back and forth from my phone to this laptop I'm speaking to you on, so if I break eye contact, just stay with me in the spirit. Harlem is, yes, the spirit meets community as advocacy. The Pastor Mike using his pulpit to make sure that we are staying healthy, mind, body, and spiritually. A dream center that renders hope with a plan, teaching us how to fish beyond a wish, to stand tall, but recognizing, oh yeah, there is a wall. But love in action conquers all. And to live that advocacy, I think about this verse from 1 Corinthians in the good book that rings. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now think about Pastor Mike and his people and their mission. This is without some kind of government commission. They want to renew and begin so that we can go within. These visionaries, dreamers, and doers of Harlem through FBC remind us to send our love through the whole village, like talking drums with faith as the power. We will get through this moment in time, this now, this hour. Harlem is healing, is so many more. Keep us thinking, believing, dreaming, and achieving. Throw your prayers in the air and wave them because you really do care. Harlem is we. Clap your soul in syncopation. A soul clap, a soul train line. For those who have answered the call, who've picked up the ball, like those with Pastor Mike and his team, with respect and gratitude, we celebrate y'all.
Hello and welcome to our audience. I'm so glad you have joined us for another of Community Works Conversations with members of the Harlem community. My name is Lee Daniels and I'm a board member of Community Works. Our guest today is Reverend Michael A. Waldron, senior pastor of First Corinthians Baptist Church in Harlem, of course. Reverend Walrond is a graduate of Morehouse College and Duke University School of Divinity in Durham, North Carolina. He pastored a church there, building its small congregation to more than 600 members. And then in 2014, accepted the invitation of the board of First Corinthians to become its pastor. When he arrived, the congregation numbered 300 members. It now numbers more than 10,000. Reverend Walrond, welcome.
Thank you for having me. The only thing I would say is it would be a short of a miracle if that growth took place in a short period. But I got there in 2004, not 14.
I'm
So
sorry, that's what I
yeah,
meant to say. Yes, thank you.
yeah. I was like, whoa, that'd be amazing.
That truly would be a miracle. Now, I've mentioned just a little of your background because I want you to tell more about your background and more about your family. So,
yeah, I'll just tell me when you want me to stop. I grew up in a town on Long Island called Roosevelt, and was the first person in my family born in the United States. Both my mom and dad are from Barbados. And so, I grew up in a very traditional West Indian household. Went on to Morehouse College, met my wife, who was a Spelman graduate. And, interestingly enough, beyond the regular challenges of being a college student, we actually had a child in college. My son was born a week after my finals of my sophomore year. We came back our junior year, and after about a month on campus, my mother-in-law at the time was watching our son, and I called her and said I was coming to get my son. And she said, for a visit. I said, no, I want him to be here with us. And so I went and got my son September of my junior year, that's 1991. And my son lived on campus with me at Morehouse in my dorm room. And he went between my dorm room and my wife's dorm room at Spelman. And then senior year, we moved off campus. And and so my son is now 30. He too is a Morehouse and Duke Divinity grad. And my daughter, who we ended up having, is 26, and she's a Spelman grad. So we kept that all in the family, and came back home in 2004. It's been an amazing journey since then. I would have never imagined, one, that I would be back in New York pastoring, and two, that the church would become what it has become. That was nothing in my thoughts. It's truly been a humbling and transformative, and I have to say a transcendent experience in many ways. What the work that the church has been able to do, what we've been able to do, and what First Corinthian has been able to do in that community. So I'm truly grateful. Truly grateful.
What drew you back to New York?
Honestly, I had grown completely satisfied with the idea that we would probably spend the rest of our lives in Durham. It was an amazing place. I wasn't just pastoring there, but I was also one of the university ministers at Duke University. So I had a pretty great situation. My wife was a principal in Durham. She was the youngest principal at the time in Durham, North Carolina, elementary school. And I'll be honest with you, Lee, our plan, they always say God laughs at our plans. Our plan was to stay there because when she became a principal, the superintendent at the time made it very clear that they were fast tracking her at some point to be a superintendent. She was a rare commodity, and a Black woman with a PhD in special education. You didn't see that too much. And so they made it very clear they were fast tracking her in the system. Well, what was attractive about the state system in North Carolina, they've changed it since we've left. But if you put 30 years in the system, you could retire. But the key was you could retire, and they would take the 3 years of your highest salary, average it out, and that's what you got until you died. And so we were like, wait a minute, this is a good deal. We could stay here in the church. And she was in ministry at the church, not officially, but she was a minister. I had licensed her, and she got ordained while at the church in North Carolina. And that was our plan. And then in 2003, I get a call from one of the trustees at First Corinthian, because my predecessor, believe it or not, this is how the story is just amazing. My predecessor at First Corinthian was my roommate at Morehouse. So he was actually my roommate when my son lived with us in the dorm. So it was me, him, and my son. And he had been at First Corinthian about 8 years, and he was moving on to do some other things. And he had told me, he said, if I leave First Corinthian, you'd be a great fit. I was like, man, I'm not leaving North Carolina. You can forget about it, to come back to Harlem. So I get the call from one of the trustees. I tell them I'm really not interested. They said, just please send a resume, because I had been preaching. The first time I preached at First Corinthian was the summer my son was born. Me and my predecessor, who wasn't the pastor at the time, we were students, of course, at Morehouse. We did a youth revival together at First Corinthian. And then when he became the pastor, I did the fall revival every year. So I knew First Corinthian. I'd been there from the time I was, 20, but I just didn't want to leave because of our plans. But I remember the day I got the call. I was with the YMCA with my children downtown Durham. And when I got off the phone, my heart just started racing. And I was like, okay, what's going on? And I really sensed that this meant what I was feeling was like, it's time for me to move on. But I was still reluctant. And I remember I sent my resume in the last day. They were accepting resumes. And I told my wife, when I go to this interview, I'm just going to be very belligerent. So I said, if they want me after my performance, I know it's really God. And I'm telling you, I was giving short answers. I seemed very disinterested. I got in an argument with the chair of the deacons and the chair of the trustees at the time. And I remember going back to the hotel. I told my wife, I said, listen, if they really want me, I said, I know it's God, but here's what happened in the interview. And this was the thing that really compelled me to want to be here. They were asking me, what's my vision for the church? And I said, I have none. I said, I pastor a church in North Carolina. I'm not the pastor of First Corinthian, so I have no vision for this church. And they were kind of taken aback. And when I said that, something came over me, Lee, and I said, but I will promise you this. I said, if you all were to call me to be the pastor of First Corinthian, and mind you, this was not in my spirit to say, it just truly came over me. I said, if you all call me to be the pastor of First Corinthian, I promise you that within a few years, there'll be people waiting online to get in this church. They all laughed when I said that. And that laugh was like the fuel that I needed. I said, I remember saying, well, if they call me, one, I know it's God. Two, if they call me, I'm going to work because they doubted what I had said. And my track record and experience in ministry was that everywhere I had worked, whether it was at Duke or the church I was serving, grew. I'm a builder. I'm not a maintenance pastor. I'm a builder. And I know those gifts God had given me. And so I got to FCBC in 04 and just started working. I got there was no staff. It was just me and two sextons part-time. And to see what it has become now, we have more than one footprint in Harlem. We have the Dream Center, which is on 119th between St. Nick and Adam Clayton Powell, which is kind of this cutting edge space. We do a lot of cutting edge programming around leadership and technology. Then we have the Hope Center, which is on 116th between Adam Clayton Powell and Frederick Douglass, which is a mental health facility, plus, FCBC. And so to see it go from what it was in 2004 to what it is now, to go from being the only person on staff to now having 32 staff members is, an amazing journey. And so, just grateful.
What, from your perspective, is Harlem?
Mm-hmm.
And how is Harlem doing? It's very easy to travel the 125th Street corridor and travel some other blocks in Harlem and see all the shininess.
Oh, yeah.
How much of the shininess is in the rest of Harlem?
Yeah, well, one, I think as an African American who is also, a student of history, Harlem plays and still plays a pivotal and historical role in the African American community. It is viewed as the Mecca of Black America. When you think about the cultural significance that Harlem plays in this world, you can't help but be humble. I remember telling someone, you walk through Harlem, it is as if you can feel the presence of a pantheon of spirits who have graced that space, who have been part of the legacy and lineage, part of the history and the transcendence of that space. Harlem is more than just that village. It is truly a transcendent idea. It speaks volumes beyond the bricks, the mortar, beyond the buildings. It speaks volumes to our culture, to our history, to our people. And the significance is really beyond the ability to be captured adequately by words. It is part of what drew me here. I want to be part of that history. I want to be part of that legacy. The names you think of when you think of Harlem, the work that took place here, the evolution and revolution on so many levels. I want to be part of that. And I wanted to really be engaged in that. And, when I came in 04, it was at a time where you could feel and sense the transition in some ways, from to this new idea, what they call the new Harlem. One of the things, you asked about the shininess. Yes, there are many pockets where there's a certain kind of vitality that is impressive and attractive to people who are not rooted in the Harlem history or culture. But there is an undercurrent and an underside of that culture that is not shiny. There's still poverty is still rampant and pervasive in many quarters. There are still people who have been relegated to the margins of our culture. There are many people who are still undercounted and unrecognized. They are not even part of the social or cultural background of Harlem. They're just completely overlooked. And many of those people are those who I find myself engaging in doing ministry and serving, because, when I hear people talk about how Harlem is changing, it has changed, but there's certain existential realities that have not changed for a large segment of our population. And so, yes, the growth is real. Yes, the transformation is real. And yes, as you say, the shininess is real. But in many spaces, there's still a shadow hanging over many people's possibilities. And so those are the persons, and that's the community I find myself engaging more so about Harlem. Whether it's our food pantry or the multiple community programs we have, Breakfast Before Books, which, we started that program because I read an article that in New York City, many children who live in shelters, it started as a summer program, don't get food. They're food insecure because when school is out, where they were getting meals, in some space they don't get that. So we started a summer feeding program. But then what happened is I started having conversations, and we had, many of our children in our community had very high tardiness record, especially children who lived in shelters. And what was happening is that many of those children were missing breakfast because they were getting there late because of the difficulty of just getting out of the shelter in the morning. And so we started Breakfast Before Books targeting these children. And so it started as 1 day a week, and then it went to 2. And during the school year, we do Breakfast Before Books 5 days a week. And we serve over 1,000 children every week. And basically, as you come to the church on your way to school, and you can tell there's many people who are late, and people can pick up a kind of grab and go breakfast. And it's not just for the children, it's for the parents as well, because many of the parents find themselves battling with those same realities. So, again, Harlem is an amazing space filled with history, potential, and possibilities. But oftentimes, those who are suffering, those who are struggling, are often overlooked when people talk about the greatness of Harlem and the significance of Harlem. And I love what you said, the shininess of Harlem. And so that is the work I felt compelled to do. The same thing with mental health. There's a great stigma in our community around mental health. And so we wanted to kind of destigmatize mental health. And it started with me talking about my own experiences with depression, anxiety from the pulpit, being very transparent and saying, this is why. Yes, I'm a person of faith, and yes, I believe in God, but me seeking therapy is no different than, someone who suffers with high blood pressure and has to get medication. We don't stigmatize that. And I remember I had a conversation, Lee, someone said, well, isn't it strange that a pastor would be telling people to see a therapist or be seeing a therapist? I said, no. I said, you don't raise that question when it comes to diabetes medication you take, and you still trust God. So seeking a therapist does not say you don't trust God. It says that you believe there are many ways that God moves and many people that God moves through. And so that was a big deal for us. And when we started it in 2016, anyone who got in the program got 12 free therapy sessions, 12 free. Now we've reduced it down to 10, and we have a staff and interns. But that was important to me because one of the things that's difficult for many of our people, because we're in a community, we normalize trauma. We experience it all the time, and we don't always understand how trauma works within our communities. And I wanted to be able to provide resources, because what makes it prohibitive for so many of us in our community is because it's cost prohibitive. Therapy is expensive. And so I want to make sure we can offer quality therapeutic care at no cost. And we've been able to do that. And what makes me so proud of that space, Lee, is that we opened it and ran it with no public funding. It was all based on church donations. And that meant a lot to me.
one of the things you said was so very interesting, that Black people have a history of normalizing trauma.
Yeah.
Because they've had to normalize trauma in order to persevere.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've often thought about, just in terms of the era of the lynching frenzy, I've often thought, what was the day after like?
Yeah.
You know, what was the day after for Black people like whenever a lynching occurred in a town? That's another item. But what I really wanted to ask is, you know, given the high profile, particularly athletes who've talked about their struggles with depression, anxiety, over the last 10 years, correct me if I'm wrong, there seems to have been a significant advance in terms of accepting the validity of asking for help with mental health issues.
Yeah, I think there has been an advance in public discourse significantly. Definitely seen the growth and expansion of the possibility of people wanting to get mental health treatment. But there's still a deep stigma attached to it on the ground. There's still people who are hesitant to talk about their battle or that they're in need. We see that. One of my Morehouse classmates, he's a professor at NYU, and one of his focal points is mental health. He runs one of the institutes over there. And what was alarming to me, the year we started the Hope Center, was that at that time, the highest rate of suicide, and this was staggering to me, the highest rate of suicide was among Black boys between the ages of 8 and 13. 8 and 13. And I had to listen again. I was on a panel and they shared the data, and I was blown away. And I thought of myself at 8 to 13 years of age. That was nothing on my mind. The fact that that was the highest rate of suicide. And now within the past year, the highest rate of suicide is with adolescent girls between 12 and 17. So these are children who are experiencing trauma, mental health crisis, but also who are viewing suicide as a viable option. And so, you know, that was one of the things that became another compelling narrative as to why it was important. So I will say that in public discourse, there's been a significant advance, but on the ground, there still haven't been the kind of provisions made to really help people, especially young people, deal with these issues around trauma, anxiety, depression. And so that's why, you know, I'm an advocate for seeing more spaces. We've partnered in the past couple of years with Columbia School of Psychiatry, Hunter College School of Social Work, NYU School of Social Work, just to find ways to expand the conversation. I was actually featured, I think it was last month, in a PBS documentary on the mysteries of mental illness. Again, I think what is tragic is that in our community, when I say our community, I mean within the Black church community, it's still not really talked about. It's still not a centering conversation. And clergy still don't talk about it. Yet, yeah, I graduated from Duke, and Duke did a study about 10 years ago and talked about, of any profession, the highest rate of suicide was among clergy, but nobody was talking about it, you know, because if you can imagine, if clergy are the ones who people go to, who does a clergy person go to? And if you're living with that stigma, you feel some kind of way about going to seek out therapy. And with this, a story, a friend of mine was a pastor, and he was serving a church. They had two services at 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock, but he had been quietly dealing with depression and anxiety and had some early tendency of bipolar. Nobody really knew except his wife. And so on this particular Sunday, he preached the 8 o'clock service. He would usually go home between services, get his family, or sometimes he just go home and have breakfast with his family, come back to the church. Well, he goes home this day. His wife and children are getting ready. He says, well, go on to church. I'll catch you. I got to do a few things before I come to church. He went into the driveway of his house, pulled out a gun and shot himself in the head. He had just preached the 8 o'clock sermon, came home, and before the 11 o'clock service, committed suicide. He was a pastor. I tell that story because the thing about it, my friend, who's another pastor, who was his very good friend of his, nobody talked about suicide. Nobody talked about depression. Nobody talked about anxiety. It just talked about the pastor died on this date, but no conversation around how he died and what happened, which means that you had a community that was traumatized, but the trauma was intensified because nobody was confronting this real issue. He was hurting. He was suffering in silence. Then we're left in the aftermath of the decision he made.
That brings up a question I was going to save until the end, but the question is, do you sometimes feel that you're Sisyphus?
Mm-hmm.
Do you, as a minister who is supposed to counsel people,
Mm-hmm.
save people,
Mm-hmm.
provide people with a way out and up, do you feel you're pushing that rock up the hill and it just keeps on rolling down?
No, absolutely not. The work never fades. The needs never disappear. But I've seen too much progress. This year marks 25 years I've been a pastor, 17 at FCBC and 8 in North Carolina. I've seen too much progress, too many people's lives shifted and transformed, too many people empowered and encouraged to be their better selves and their best selves. So I've seen too much good to even feel that way. There are moments where you find yourself on larger social issues. What will progress look like? What I tell younger pastors is you need to find those areas within ministry where you can devote your greatest passions and you just put your nose to the ground and work. Your job is not to worry, will you change the world? Because what is good is it to change the world if you can't change the corner where the church is, if you can't have an impact in the congregation, on the community. And so I definitely don't feel like Sisyphus, although, Camus has definitely been someone who has been part of my narrative dealing with the absurd, right? But just, yesterday we were recording for service and a Duke Divinity alum called me. She was in town, had a group of young leaders from colleges around the country in Harlem. They were supposed to go to Israel, but the trip was canceled. They were going to come to New York, fly to Israel. But they decided to come to Harlem and like this kind of like a cultural experience. She asked, could we bring the students by the church? I said, fine. Some were still in undergrad. Some had just graduated and were kind of in between. But there was this leadership program. And so they came there and there was some Morehouse men there and actually a couple of Duke Divinity graduates who were leading the program. But there was one young lady, after the students were leaving, she comes back to me and she said, Pastor Mike, you don't know me. She said, when I was in college, I did an internship here in 2014 in New York City. And someone introduced me to FCBC. And she started crying. And I was like, oh, wow. She said, I need to thank you. She said, because your sermon that day literally changed the direction of my life. It changed everything about my life. And since that sermon, she said, I've not been the same. I made decisions that changed that for the better. And she just thanked me. How grateful. When you hear stories like that, it is always a reminder of the role that we play as clergy, but that oftentimes we touch people we will never meet, never know, but will have an indelible impact upon. So I've seen too much growth, too much process, too many stories like that to ever allow, in some ways, a pessimistic moment. Now, they are tiring and fatiguing days, but I still I'm constantly hopeful and grateful to serve this way.
What is the significance of the founders of First Corinthians choosing to call it First Corinthians?
I don't really, they started in 1933. I don't really know. Now, I remember when I got to the church and over the years, we had flirted with changing the name. And when I got to the church, I started teaching because, I said, First Corinthian is known for being a very fractured and splintered church in the Bible. The church at First Corinth had a lot of problems that Paul had to address. And I said, I don't know if, we want to be identified as a fractured, splintered, problematic church. And so we talked about that. What happened is, I thought about what we would name it, what it would be, all these things. We had conversations. No one was really oppositional to it. But at that time, nobody was really calling about 4 years in, was calling it First Corinthian. Everybody who knows it now just says FCBC. And so there are people now who've come to FCBC who really don't know that First Corinthian is the name of the church. I kid you not. I remember one time I mentioned First Corinthian, a young lady said to me, is that the name of the FC? And she had been there for a couple of years. But everybody says FCBC. And I guess she never felt like trying to find out what does FCBC mean, but FCBC. And so, That's what it's been for several years now. So most people say, oh, FCBC, around the country. People know that. And there's a couple other FCBCs that people know of in California, but FCBC is what it is. But First Corinthians, interesting that they chose that. But you have to remember too, in those days, a lot of our clergy were not necessarily trained theologically or biblically. Still the case now, And so that kind of biblical insight and knowledge, to let it be shaping and foundational in terms of how you engage ministry, wasn't always taking place. But people did what was popular. First Corinthians was a book in the Bible. Hey, let's name the church after a book in the Bible. First Corinthian.
So let me go back to a question about the broader Harlem community.
Mm-hmm.
And this perhaps has something to do with my talking about the shininess that is so visible these days.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if people recognize people outside of Harlem, certainly, and perhaps even inside of Harlem, some recognize how complex institutionally Harlem is. It seems to me as a board member of Community Works that even I sometimes am surprised by how many institutions and individuals are working to make Harlem better.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to say the downside is that sometimes those institutions don't necessarily work together and find themselves doing overlapping work. Yeah, I think people don't realize that Harlem is more, than 125th and the Apollo. It is an amazing mosaic of organizations that are seeking to not just sustain legacy, but sustain people in some very intentional ways that, behind the scenes, there are people whose names we may not know, but have touched so many lives and changed so many spaces. We know of the name. You mentioned certain names connected to Harlem. You know those names. You know the legacy of these people. You know the institutions they represent. But I found that there are many people whose names are not so common, who really play a deep role in the identity of that community. I learned that, in 2014 when I ran for Congress.
Mm-hmm.
I met people who in themselves were embodiments of certain institutions built around sustenance and survival, and some people who I never known, whose names are not common, but in their community, on their block, in their association, they are part of the lifeblood of so many other people's existence. And so those are the stories, but many communities are like that. I think what makes Harlem so different is because it's such a known space. People actually think Harlem is a borough, right? So they think that it's a borough unto itself. They don't realize that it's a village, but it is a congested village. It is a vibrant village. It is a complicated space filled with complexities that can be staggering, overwhelming, and intimidating, with institutions that are all seeking to participate in ways to lift certain people and also reinforce, tragically, certain institutions that have become such a part of the fabric that you wonder whether they still have critical impact. But it's all of that, it is all of those things that makes it so profound. And, I don't see it as a new Harlem versus an old Harlem. I do see it as an evolution. But people also, this, Lee, the reality is that people, and many people in Harlem had at one point, we were both here for this, we're getting frustrated. You saw this influx of white people into Harlem, right? You hit the traditional statements, I saw a white woman walking a dog at 12 at night, 12 in the morning. Like, this is not Harlem. Harlem has changed. And the thing is, that is true. The demographics have changed in many ways. My only hope is that those who are part of the quote unquote new Harlem understand they're part of a rich legacy and history, who want to see it maintained and not trampled on and upon for the sake of political, social, and economic gain. That those who are here want to maintain, because again, Harlem is not buildings. It's not the restaurants. Harlem is the people. And if the people no longer have a place, Harlem is not Harlem. And so we have to be intentional around making sure we have spaces and places. And those who have been historic Harlem residents, those who have given their lives to stay in that place through some of the darkest times from the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we don't reward them by pricing them out, right? So we want to make sure that those who come and understand that Harlem is people, but if you push the people out, Harlem is no longer Harlem. And so I hope that it's a beautiful balance of evolution and remembrance, right? Growth and restoration, expanded possibilities, but also redemptive practices to make sure we maintain the sanctity of that village.
Mm-hmm. You may, I think you just answered this question, but back in the 1980s, when I was a reporter at the New York Times, I wrote 2.5 years worth of pieces on the Harlem of that time and the effort of community leaders with, of all things, the Koch administration to try to preserve a significant chunk of Harlem for low and moderate income housing.
Yeah.
The interior blocks between 111th Street and 123rd Street. And I think that was successful. And to me, it gave Harlem a future of how to deal with gentrification.
Yeah.
Because one could see, even at that time, that gentrification was coming. And I think more than any other city, any other neighborhood in the country, Harlem has a way of just what you were talking about, of combining, of preserving, but also of moving into the future in terms of who is going to live where.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if that's the correct assessment of what the future can hold for Harlem.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that work you did and many who participated to seek to preserve low and moderate income housing is intentional. I think we do, though, have to be mindful and careful that, and it's just reality, that political, economic forces don't combine to undermine the intention of sustaining that community. If you think back in the 80s when you were doing these pieces, there was a plethora of abandoned buildings and empty lots. Well, people didn't realize those lots were purchased. They were owned, and they were waiting it out. Waiting out this phase through the crack era, and they were incentivized by the city to wait it out, and were had the abatement of taxes and things of the sort. The fear is that you could see a progression into the future without the maintenance of providing housing for folk, especially when and it's not a conversation that people are having, but many people don't realize that we're experiencing the privatization of Nycha housing in Harlem. And think about what happens. You privatize public housing, give people vouchers to possibly find somewhere else, and then you transform these buildings into luxury apartment buildings. That is happening. I'm not too far from us on 114th Street. They purchased a row of walk-ups. Gave some people $20,000 to leave. For some folk who've not seen that money before, hey, this is great. And it was an attempt to push. We saw that block change literally. And so I think, again, the only fear I have is that, again, a combination of political and economic forces push a progression that negatively impacts those who, as you said, need low and moderate income housing. But historically, what we're seeing, and I have to remind some people, we're not seeing just an influx of gentrification. We're actually seeing a reclamation of a space that was white once, in their mind, And I have to tell them, and I said it to someone, I said, what do you mean? I said, well, before the development of viable sanitation means, Black people lived down the Wall Street area. We were downtown by the water. That was the worst place to be until we created viable sanitation ways of disposal of waste. And many of these buildings we see further uptown were built by wealthy whites. And I think across from our church is Graham Court, which I believe was originally built by the Astors, right? And that's why you see these huge apartments with maids' quarters in some of these buildings we have. They were built for wealthy people. But you know, when you develop viable sanitation, now that area downtown becomes waterfront property. we come uptown now, right? So you had this geographical shifting based on economic progress and also scientific progress led to certain kind of relocating populations, you know, of New York City. And now what we experience is gentrification is kind of for some people, I have to believe in some people's minds who may know the history, it's kind of reclaiming a space that was once shaped by whiteness. And that narrative of whiteness had so disappeared for so many decades that, you know, it became foreign. So now we can say gentrification, but if you understand the history of New York City and the geographical history of New York City, white people in Harlem is not new.
Yeah.
It is not new.
Right.
So,
Right. It just means more work.
more work. And just means that we have to make sure that we preserve spaces for a people who really brought and gave significance to that village. It is a cultural experience when you walk through Harlem. It is a hallowed place. You, as I said, you could feel the presence, hear the voices of people who shaped that, from, you know, literary giants, musical giants, cultural icons. I mean, it's all in that village. You learn so much. There was some people were saying how, you know, we have tourists that come through Harlem on some Sundays and they go to church, and the people had a problem with that. And I had an interview and I said, well, you know, have you actually studied the highest group of tourists that come into Harlem? What do you think they're from? And they were like, oh, you know, France, and, you know, some said Spain. And I said, no, the highest tourist group is Black people who come from around the country and come to Harlem. And the reason why we don't call them tourists, because they look like us, right? So that's interesting, but yeah.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, we have to end. I'm so appreciative of talking to you about this, Reverend Walrond, and
Yeah.
I'm sure FCBC will continue its great work in the community, and it's been wonderful. I will leave you and our audience with. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Adam Clayton Powell, so I spent time at the Schomburg, the old Schomburg, researching. So let me use Adam Clayton Powell's words to say goodbye for the moment to you and our audience. Keep the faith, baby.
That's
Keep
it.
the faith.
That's it. I appreciate you. And thank you for having me today.
Thank you.
Absolutely, sir.
On behalf of viewers and Barbara Horowitz of Community Works and Boza Rivers of New Heritage Theater Group, very special thanks to Lee and Pastor Mike. Whew, what a powerful conversation. Special thanks to our key funders who have made this possible: Con Edison, Humanities NY, and Josh Horowitz. We'll see you uptown. We'll see you around. Stay safe. And when you come ready to get down. We'll see you in Harlem. Peace.